Hello, folks. Well, what did you think of Epaphroditus in our reading this week? Quite a commendation Paul gives him, right? We might ask why Paul tells the story of Epaphroditus. Well, one reason is surely that he wants the Philippians themselves to appreciate Epaphroditus for what he has done on their behalf. After all, they sent him to Paul in Rome in order to serve him and do for him what they could not do for him. And so he wants them to appreciate him. But also, he seems to be using Epaphroditus as another example of what it means to put others first and to consider the interests of others over one's own. Go back to chapter 2 and verse 4. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. And then he gives the example of Jesus, who did just that. And he follows that up with the example of Timothy, for whom he says, I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare, verse 20. And so he wants to use the example of Epaphroditus to encourage the Philippians to imitate his unselfish behavior. And surely that kind of unselfish behavior will lead to less bickering, less quibbling, less infighting in the church in Philippi. But what a commendation. Verse 25, my brother, my co-worker, a fellow soldier, your messenger, your minister to my need. And then a little bit later in verses 29 and 30, welcome him and honor such people because he came close to death for the work of Christ and risked his own life to make up for the services that you could not give me because you were away. So what a commendation. Now here's an interesting verse. I just have to say something about it. Verse 27, God had mercy on Epaphroditus. That must be a reference to the fact that God had a direct hand in healing him. But I want you to notice more what Paul says a little bit later. I was spared one sorrow after another. Because God had mercy upon Epaphroditus, I was spared one sorrow after another. So Paul had known sorrow? Yes. I don't know what it was that was causing him sorrow at the time, but that verse obviously says he felt sorrow. Now, the reason why I think that is important is because of this. In this letter, Paul is repeatedly talking about rejoicing and about joy. And this verse should surely demonstrate to us that joy does not mean the absence of sorrow, but rather the capacity to rejoice in the midst of it. I think that's interesting. Now take a look at chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Here, Paul sets himself forward as living evidence of the failure of righteousness based on Torah observance, or based upon observance of the law. This is why verse 1 makes sense in this context. Paul is telling them to rejoice in the Lord, not in the observance of the law, not in the flesh, not in human achievement. Our joy should be found in our relationship with the Lord, not in any human achievement that we might be able to produce. Paul is showing in this passage that as for human achievement, he had every reason to trust in it, but he realized that trusting in it was a dead end. It would not give him a right standing with God. And those who trust in Jesus are the true circumcision. Now, let's talk a little bit about application. In verse 30, we learn that Epaphroditus risked his life for the work of Christ. That is, his illness was the direct result of his risking his life for the sake of the work of Christ. And we might imagine this scenario. Epaphroditus and a colleague are on their way to Rome in order to help Paul. But on the way, Epaphroditus becomes ill. His colleague returns to Philippi to inform the brothers and sisters there that Epaphroditus has become ill, and they're worried about that. But Epaphroditus, because of his commitment to Jesus and because of his commitment to Philippi, the church in Philippi, to complete the mission that he had been given, commits himself to going on to Rome even though he's sick. He's risking his life for the sake of carrying out the work of Christ and fulfilling his mission. You say, well, Kerry, what is the application there? Just here. The point I want to make here is all about risk-taking. Are you a risk-taker? In our culture, taking risks is primarily related to business ventures. But I wonder if we ever take risks for the love of Christ, or if we ever take risks for one another. And from this passage, I want to encourage us to take more risks for Jesus. Go ahead and talk to that neighbor about the Lord and about how much He means to you. Go ahead and confront that brother or sister who needs a helping hand, or maybe who needs a stern rebuke. Take a risk that your friendship might end because of your overall concern in the spiritual welfare of your brother or sister. And we could talk even more about how churches need to take risks, but I'm going to leave that alone for now. I'm just saying, Epaphroditus is an example here of being a risk taker for the work of Christ. We do it for other things, in other areas of life. Let's take risks for Jesus. They're calculated risks after all, right? Because anyone who risks based on Jesus and trusts in Him will not be disappointed. And then I want to say, just as a reminder, there is no future in works righteousness. There is no future in trusting in our observance of God's law, whatever that is. So our boasting and our confidence must be in Jesus Christ alone. So I want to encourage us in this video to trust completely in Jesus, and to develop a trust that is found entirely in Him and not on anything that we might do. Okay, brief preview of chapter 3, verses 6 through 11. If there is no future in Paul's religious past, where does the future lie? Paul will tell us that the future lies in knowing Christ. And what does that mean? Well, that's what we're going to learn about and discuss in the next few verses. God bless.